Hello and welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. My name is Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti and our special guest. Björn Peters is a physicist and energy economist, entrepreneur, and an author writing about a strategy he calls ecological realism. In 2018, he co-founded the Nuclear Pride Coalition and a nuclear startup company in 2021. He's here today to speak with us about the recent blackout in Spain and explain what energy strategies we might learn from this disaster. Welcome again, Björn. We figured out you've been here 3 or 4 times, I think. It's good to see you.
Yes, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
So, Spain had a blackout. This is now known as the Iberian Peninsula blackout. We had heard that it was linked to overcapacity of intermittent renewables and their impact on the grid. But maybe, just maybe I live in a bubble. Is that the reality? Is that the cause? And really, how bad was this blackout?
It was warm, it was 25 degrees, but if a blackout happens in winter and maybe not only half a day, but 2 days when food and water, and so even water gets scarce. And supermarkets are not operating because they have electrical doors and electrical payment systems, and nothing is working any longer. So this is really, we haven't seen a true stress test of the system yet.
Renewables come and go within the matter of hours. Why didn't it just come back?
We do have an European network of transmission service operators. That's ENTSO-E, as it's the acronym. They together have created by far the biggest machine on Earth. So all the European grids and the grids around the Mediterranean Sea, so from the Atlantic to the Ural, so even Russia has been included. It has now been excluded as well. But all these transmission service operators are working together very nicely, and it's usually a very, very stable grid. So something apparently went wrong on the Iberian Peninsula. That is mostly Spain and Portugal. A little bit of Grenada is there. So this is and it's very weakly connected to the French grid, which is on the northeast from the Iberian Peninsula. Just to give you a picture. And actually, that's why I believe that it's rather a helpful model if you compare it to the United States, because what I've learned there, and maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, the state grids are not connected too well to each other in the United States. And so we will delve a little bit into the question what the grid connection really does and where it helps and why it was problematic that it was missing there. But I would like first to introduce a model system which comes from biology. If somebody dies or gets a heart attack, there's usually 2 questions. So what caused it in the short term? So was there a shock? There some abuse of alcohol or substance or overly stressful situation right now that caused the heart attack? That is probably some unhealthy life, lack of sleep over years and months that provided the root cause that something bad could happen. And this is the way we need to discern on the Spanish blackout situation. So the exact precise analysis still has to be done, and the ENTSO-E, so this transmission service operator organization, has set up an expert committee. They will take probably until the end of the year to carefully analyze millisecond by millisecond what has happened. But here is my take. I've published a little bit on this. The thing that people could observe, so everyone could observe, was that there were frequency oscillations in the grid all the morning, but in particular in the half hour approximately before the blackout that occurred at 12:33, so it's shortly after noon. And within 20 seconds, the grid destabilized to a very bad degree so that it broke down. So what happened then afterwards? So the entire grid was gone. The measurement showed still that about half of the grid was there, but it was not. So we know this from nowadays. So the data was even wrong. And it took the engineers, the electrical engineers at the Spanish grid operator, about 20 hours to restore the net. And they couldn't do it as long as the sun was shining. So they had to wait for the night when there were no disturbing solar PV parks disturbing all of this. The grid came back relatively quickly. There were only a handful of fatalities thanks to the great work of the electric engineers there. The question now is, why did it happen in first place?
Mhm. And so we cannot narrow down the cause of this blackout to one essence. That would be incorrect to say it was a gas plant that tripped or it was a oscillation. It was the combination of these confounding factors that resulted in the event. So
Exactly.
I just wanted
Yes.
to re-summarize is avoid putting everything in this blackout on a single essence, on avoid essentializing the problem into one root cause.
Yeah, because there are always root causes. I mean, some elements within such a big grid always fail. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but there is always some backup system so that the integrated system can cope with local failure somewhere. And if the local failure needs to break down, this is a clear indication of the organism as a total being sick somehow. And this is what we need to understand and what we need to analyze now.
So, is there a truth? Is there a connection between the increasing share of renewables and a failure of grid stability?
That is something that can certainly be confirmed. Yes, it has something to do with it. And at the time of the blackout, only 26% of the power came in Spain from rotating masses, so spinning generators from thermal power plants. Unfortunately, nuclear power plant was off service on maintenance, and 3 out of 5 hydropower plants were on service at that time. And unfortunately, the only nuclear power plant that was in service and not on the grid, so in maintenance, was the one that was able to do a black start of the grid. So they at the end they had to do the black start in the night with only 3 hydropower plants that were able to do so. So all the rest was a very bright morning with lots of solar energy in the grid and wind energy. It was a light breeze, but the wind power was providing about a quarter of the power, or 20%, a little bit more than 20%, and lots of it came from solar PV. And all of these produce a DC current that is then by an inverter converted into AC. The AC generators, so the thermal power plants with spinning masses, these spinning masses, so a large nuclear power plant that's 600 tons turning with 3,000 times per minute. So there's a lot of energy in these spinning masses, and they provide the inertia that is required in a grid. That if someone switches on, for example, a big machine, there's a signal sent back to the grid that can cause problems, but in a stable grid with lots of spinning masses, the signal is simply absorbed by the spinning masses. So the energy that is required to balance out some peak signal in the grid in voltage, that comes from spinning masses, and it both positively and negatively. So if a little bit of mass is missing, then the energy comes from the spinning wheel within a second or so, and then there's passive systems going on to bring more steam to the turbine automatically, so the generator slows down. And the other way, it's exactly the same. So if the grid is provided with energy for some reason, because you suddenly switch off something, for example, then the generator can absorb some energy. And then again, there's a little less steam than brought to the turbine automatically. So these are passive systems, and they have the property to slow down the reaction. So that's inertia. It's called inertia by the electrical engineers. And in contrast with the inverters, they react on the grid. So they do this very quickly, but so within a millisecond or so. But this millisecond is enough to send some signals to the grid as well. So, and send it back. And now when you have a grid with a lot of inverters, the situation can arise that they receive information from each other and suddenly get into a coherent behavior. So where usually every generator is independent from each other and does a local absorbing of noise signals, let's say, of disturbing signals, suddenly you get a coherent behavior over 1,000 kilometers. And this could exactly be measured. We really need to understand this. I said it initially at the beginning. We saw something like frequency oscillations. The frequency of the grid was going up and down. And now the frequency of the grid is the most important steering, the control parameter in any electrical AC grid. So if there is a signal on the control parameter, that means if this is dampened fast, nothing happens. But if it increases, depending on this frequency in the grid, all these systems react. You might create additional instability in the grid because suddenly an inverter says, okay, I'm off, or the other one says, well, I want to protect myself from too high voltage, something like this, and switches off. But this again sends a signal to the system, and it becomes uncontrollable. And that is so deeply worrying that with an increasing market share of solar and wind power, which something which we have essentially very often particularly in springtime when temperatures are still cold, so the solar PV is operating at a high efficiency rate, and there's nice breezes going through. That is a very typical market situation when the electrical generation from thermal power plants is pushed out of the market. I rather call them weather-dependent energies. They have a feed-in priority, and they have the right to offload all the energy they produce into the grid by law. And this really has to change. And actually, that's something we can see. Only a week later in Spain, there was a similar weather, and the grid operators were keeping, instead of 25% rotating masses in the grid, they were keeping 40% of rotating masses in the grid, and there was no instability in the grid. So no funny frequency signals in the grid.
And let's go over this a little bit in more detail for our viewers. Essentially, what you say when a rotating generator, a large coal plant, a medium to large hydro, or a medium to large nuclear plant, maybe even a small nuclear plant, it has a rotating mass. The steam is pushing it, and the amount of energy extracted from that steam is directly linked to the generation, and the generation is directly linked to transformers, directly linking it to the rest of the grid. So there is a analog mechanism, at which energy is absorbed from the thermal mass directly into the frequency of the grid. And so if the frequency dips up or down, it increases or decreases the amount of energy, the rate of energy or power that is put onto the grid. And
Yes,
it smooths it.
very
Yeah.
importantly, this happens based off the laws of nature instantaneously, so
Mm-hmm.
without any delay.
So if you have a direct current, it's taking in energy from the sun, it's flowing electrons in a steady current, and that steady current goes to an inverter, a digital inverter with a logical gate that turns on or off the supply. I did a really quick search. I think it's on the order of like 50 to 10 to 50 milliseconds. Is it faster or slower than that to your knowledge?
50 hertz means that 20 milliseconds is one entire cycle already. So it is reacted in a sub-millisecond range. And then, of course, there are modern inverters coupled to a battery system that can take on some of those roles of accepting energy when there's an excess in the grid and providing a little bit energy when there's a lack of it. But still, all of this doesn't happen instantaneously, but based on control signals. So it will be delayed by many microseconds. And these microseconds again, if you so this is standard signal analysis. Any temporal signal you can translate into a frequency domain. It provides a signal in the Fourier spectrum, so you get overtones essentially
Mm-hmm.
from the 50 hertz behavior, disturbing the control parameter with overtones. That is something that is rather inconvenient and it can lead to system failure.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, I mean, the proof is in that this event occurred. I mean, not to be too simplistic about it, but it is and will be forever the kind of an event that we point to and ask, is grid instability from renewables a myth, as renewable supporters love to claim? Is it fact or is it myth? And looking at the state of the art today, it seems that we have a work to do until we can call this a myth. We need
Yeah.
frequency control from batteries. We need either randomize the response time of these inverters. We need all sorts of technical improvements to allow renewable systems to be truly a feature of stability rather than a risk of instability.
Yes, and that's why I call it the Fukushima moment, when people suddenly understand that a system they consider to be very robust has properties that they need to deal with. And I don't say that it's impossible to deal with it electronically, as I said, so with randomized answers and all of this. But currently, nothing in the grid is prepared for such intelligent behavior. I've seen now from actually a researcher from the Netherlands pointed me to a paper on modern inverters that can do this and that and that and this. But this is just so on the level of a theory. It still has to be implemented. And then if it is implemented, we don't even know whether it will be working. We have to test it. And the test is the living system. And that's something I find very much worrying.
We had this big deal about hardening transformers about a decade ago, but maybe we have unresolved new vulnerabilities from something like the inverter situation. Do you see this being able to adapt to something like that, or do we have more work ahead of us?
Actually, so I'm not an electrical engineer, but I have seen that there are actually quite some papers already out there on these modern inverter systems linked to batteries and that they could provide a little bit more system stability or the system stability inducing behavior. Now, this is all very nice to know, but the question is, when will it be implemented? And will people be forced to change their inverters with these new systems? And this is something I haven't seen any type of political movement to impose this on the operators of solar and wind parks. And this is something I find deeply worrying. We haven't taken action in that direction yet. Whether these types of inverters coherently work only individually, will they make it possible to get to 100% solar and wind driven system? I heavily doubt it. The thing is, you can't simulate such a system behavior because it's far too complex. You don't know on what time resolution you have to simulate the system precisely. Is it a millisecond or is it a microsecond or even a nanosecond required in order to prove the stability? I am a physicist. I specialized in dynamical system behavior. I was in doing the PhD in brain sciences, so I was analyzing brain data and developing time series analysis methods. And colleagues of mine, they analyzed the data from epilepsy patients. And so, believe it or not, but they were from subcranial electrodes that were taking the measuring data, and you can measure the dimensionality of data, and the higher the dimensionality, the more complex the data is. And in the brain, usually the dimension was in the order of 9, whatever that number means. But during an epileptic seizure, it went down to below 3. And interestingly, half an hour before the seizure, it came down to 5 to 6. And at that time, they experimented and found a solution that if you send a shock, as a little electrical shock signal to the brain, and you can prevent the seizure. This is something we can learn from the Spanish situation. The frequency oscillations is a sign of coherent behavior of an entire system.
And I know some people would definitely take issue with calling this a Fukushima moment. It's more accurately not only confusion over the name, this is a Chernobyl moment. We actually, like the Soviets, believed, or at least the direct engineers responsible, believed that their plant was stable at that point. It proved them to not be stable. The neutron absorber went away and the power spiked up and you had instability. And so I just want to make sure, please call this a Chernobyl moment. This is quite widespread and it is relatively deadly. So I think that fits.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And let's regroup on the frequency oscillations. So in the brain, there are 9 patterns. And when these patterns drop or coalesce together and start to fall into phase, dropping from 9 to 5 or 6, that predicts an epileptic seizure. And during the seizure, more patterns collapse, so there's only 3 independent waves.
Yes.
That's such a great analogy for what's happening when we get these patterns, the ping pong of inverters responding to each other, taking many currencies, and they start to work together and oscillate into bigger and bigger variations. And that is the cause of the eventual trips in the system. So what happens, and let's go back to exactly what happens when that variation in voltage gets too large.
Yes. What happened very precisely, and this is something we know already, apparently a substation in the grid in southern Spain broke down within 3 seconds. There was a breakdown of one of the 2 French connections, and they were exporting energy because there was an excess of it. The power was now taking the second of 2 lines to France. It got overloaded, and this alone the system could have managed it, but then something, and we don't know exactly what it is, additionally happened that solar parks of several gigawatt simultaneously switched off their feed-in. And this provided suddenly a disastrous situation that the system couldn't handle any longer. So it broke down all of those small inverters and power stations they have protection switches, automatic ones. So they get then off grid and everything broke down. And what I've heard from Enel, Spanish TSO, is that they tried all day long to get the grid back up, but as long as there were those inverters from the large solar power parks, it didn't work. So they had to wait the night, and then it was relatively quickly. And so in the after sunset, they could do it. The weather dependent energies were the problem, and the second was that in the next week, when the situation was similar, they kept 40% of spinning masses in the grid. So with thermal power, they didn't switch them totally off, didn't so it rather curtailed the weather-dependent energies.
And so, to reiterate, this solar actually prevented a black start. Is that because once there was enough current that the inverter thought the grid would be healthy, it flooded more current into the grid?
Exactly. So
Oh.
this was simply too much. It was happening at a too big a scale to really get it back online. And then these inverters from the solar stations and the wind power stations, are a consumer of the grid stability. So they consume it and then try to synchronize. And if they synchronize too quickly, then this can lead to disaster again. And that's what apparently was observed, according to NL.
So, with the difference between a 25% and a 40% spinning reserve, you're contending that this is an important feature of grid health at this time with the current deployed technologies. So tell us more about what that spinning reserve has done to maintain stability on the Iberian grid.
Well, on the Iberian grid, they didn't have the chance to keep it stable, so because it was not there. And a week later, when it was there, the system kept the stable situation. Compare it now to the German situation. Germany has a very similar strategy, phasing out nuclear energy and drastically increase the market share of weather-dependent energies. So if there's an increase in alternative energies, it will be solar and wind. And these are the weather dependent energies, and those ones that create all of those problems. Now, in Germany, we have, of course, a much bigger grid. It's about twice, a little bit more than twice the size in terms of gigawatt in average consumption. And it is heavily interconnected to, I believe, 9 neighbors. The Iberian grid is connected to Europe by a 3 gigawatt total, or lines, 2 lines with 3 gigawatts in total, whereas we have connectors of about nearly 10 times this amount.
Hmm.
So we can piggyback on our neighbors' grid stability much longer than Spain can do, but the structural issue is, of course, exactly the same. And one of the really cumbersome facts in the German grid is that we have so-called balcony power stations. You can buy in the supermarket small solar panels with something like 500 watt in power, put it to your balcony, switch it on. And of course, there's no way to control the power from the part of the grid operator. So this is just firing, firing, firing when the sun is shining and not firing if it's gray or if it's dark. We've had a very fast solar build out in Germany in the last 2 years, and half of this power is not controllable. It's just firing. And that means if something goes wrong, parts of the grid will have to be switched off actively, so in brownouts, in order to preserve the stability of the entire grid and to avoid a blackout, so an uncontrolled system failure, as we saw it in Spain.
And I want to talk about these small panels, 500-watt systems. There's nothing separating them from the grid. Is that limited to a small size, or
Yes.
can okay?
But the sheer number of them
Mhm.
makes them so that they go into the double-digit gigawatt range nowadays. So
So
they're very popular.
Yeah. So
Let's
just
do
the
that.
sheer number of them has created a problem that the size limitation probably was meant to avoid.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget with these types of weather dependent energies, they have a very high production synchronization over very large distances. So either the sun is shining, and if my solar park is producing, then of course my neighbors as well. And the same with wind power. So if there's wind probably in an area of 500 miles around me. And every windmill in the vicinity will produce when my windmill is producing, and this is a behavior that is very detrimental to a system because in a power grid, it can't be repeated often enough. You have to produce exactly every second, exactly the amount of energy that the consumer consume. In the weather dependent energies, they have only two states. They're producing either too much or too little, but never exactly the right amount. So the responsibility for keeping the grid stable must go to somewhere. And it is, I call it a parasitic behavior of the owners of the weather dependent energy power stations. They piggyback on the operations of those ones who keep the system stable without giving back anything. And that is by biologic analogy, this is parasitic behavior.
In the US, our home systems are parasitic as well, because of course we have net metering. We charge not
Even.
the
Oh,
way
wow.
internet used to be charged. It used to be that you would say, okay, however much uh, power or bandwidth you used, 95% of the time, we would ignore that and take the top 5%. And then we would charge you for the highest speed in that top 5%. And if you're over some limit, well, then you're in trouble. and and so this is different from net metering, where it's just the gigabytes or gigawatt hours in this case. It's totally paved over and averaged over the entire month, no matter what the spot price is, no matter what the
Mhm.
demand of the grid is. And as you said, we have to know exactly how much demand exists because we have to exactly match demand with supply. And so the US small photovoltaics are precisely parasitic because they do not pay for their demand when the price is highest, and they are compensated, they're overcompensated when prices are lowest.
Yeah.
The other
Actually, I,
thing,
I would
oh,
still defend such a regime. So it
mhm,
really makes sense to introduce PV to a market. But the thing is, in Germany, we started this 35 years ago to subsidize solar and wind energy. And it were small projects at the times, and everyone was a fan of it, me, included myself. So, but with the increasing market share, these technologies need to take on responsibility for the entire grid.
yeah,
And that's something I find very much worrying that even after decades of subsidizing them, they couldn't even survive without heavily supporting them with subsidies, with of financial type and of operative type.
we do not have a small solar exemption, as far as I know. Maybe there are a few states that do, but we do not have the 500-watt system. There is a very strictly regulated, battery backup required and upgraded meter required, so that you can run independently of the grid. And this is seen as a conspiracy of the grid operators, the fossil fuel corporations, against small independent power producers. But the reality, as we've sort of discussed, the reality is it is financially parasitic, and it's parasitic on the notion of stability.
We should rely on forms of energies and technologies that work even if scaled up. And this is something people have ignored for far too long. yes, that's something we need to fix definitely and relatively quickly. And just because of these weather-dependent energies never producing the right of amount of energy.
Yeah. Well, let me before we get into other problems with Texas, for example, had another blackout that's not too dissimilar from this. Let's go back and remember Texas, the Texas freeze. This was a predicted period of low renewable supply. So Texas went from a anticipated very healthy renewable supply to having a big solar storm come down and really focus on Texas. And this is caused by, of course, the instability of the jet stream, the wobble of the jet stream, which lets Arctic winds and Arctic low pressure systems push down into lower latitudes. This caused unexpected freezes. There were gas failures. There was even a nuclear plant that was forced offline by a failing sensor, and so the personnel there had to shut it down to fix that sensor, a precautionary shutdown.
Yeah.
But the wind and solar wasn't there because the weather conditions, and there is a lot of instinct to essentialize the cause of this failure. Was it that there was not weatherization on the wind? Was there not enough weatherization on the gas or nuclear? Was it because the wind and solar was lacking when it could have been there? These all are contributory to the lack of supply and the requirement to put as much gas as possible into Texas, resulting in a big curtailment of power and a very, very big spike in prices. And so this is the Texas freeze power crisis. It was not it was I guess minutes from an Iberian style blackout is what we had heard. And of course, huge financial hit to many people who were using the on-demand power pricing strategies. I believe companies may have even gone bankrupt, or it might have been a grid supplier that did this kind of pricing model.
Yeah, and we did have brownouts in Texas.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
parts of the grid had to be switched off, and this in a time when power was really fatally important.
yeah. And so, yeah, similar to the Iberian blackout, it we should avoid being too essentialist in saying that there was one single cause. It was many contributing factors, and I definitely
Mhm.
agree that it's important to get a whole system view with no spinning reserve in Texas, with only a couple of nuclear plants, with more transition away from coal and towards gas. There's a great vulnerability there, and as well relying on this heavily weather dependent power supply is also a contributory factor.
It is.
Why don't you give us some good news? We had heard that Denmark lifted their moratorium on nuclear.
Oh, it was even better. 3 weeks ago, we had the best week for nuclear energy since probably ever, because on the Thursday morning of the week, I believe it
Right.
have been the 15th of May, as you said, Denmark lifted the ban on nuclear energy. In the afternoon, the Belgian parliament voted to keep their nuclear power plants much longer, so an additional, I believe, 20 years. And they had a phase out, so they stopped their phase out, nuclear phase out. Denmark has never had nuclear power stations. They actually run nuclear research center. Once even was there when I was a PhD student because my PhD supervisor, is a Dane, and he was working there, and I visited him once for 4 weeks or so, and he helped me a little bit. So they still have a nuclear research center, but they have the ban, or used to have the ban until 3 weeks ago. On Friday, the 16th, the Spanish Parliament, in response to the blackout, um, voted only a motion. So this has not been put in law yet, but it was a motion accepted by a very broad majority to reconsider the nuclear phase out. And on the weekend thereafter, the new elect Chancellor Merz of Germany had a meeting with President Macron from France. And so Germany has had a really a bad history of blocking nuclear policies in Europe. And Friedrich Merz promised to end this so that Germany wouldn't obstruct nuclear policies on the European and French level any longer. So were four major decisions within a couple of days. It was the best week for nuclear ever. So
Wonderful.
yeah.
That's really exciting. Would you like to tell us anything about your writing? Is there something about your book you want to get into before we go?
Actually, I've just today I got the news that a scientific article of mine, together with a friend, was published after weeks of peer review. It was really demanding, and we're dealing um, with the German power system, and we analyze the physical basis of the political decisions, which was a study made by some institutes that sound scientific, but they are not. So they're not publishing in proper scientific literature. But we did this energy system modeling, and we found out that this strategy of phasing out fossil fuels by 2045 is inachievable, even with the most optimistic assumptions when you do the analysis based on real world data. So we had the entire years of weather years and grid years of 2023 and 2024, and scaled it up according to the political plans. And we demonstrated that this does not work. So it can't work. So there's always a gap of many hours where there's no power at all, which would lead to a breakdown of the German economy. And this was really interesting. So I hope it's very well received. So this was the good news from today. So I'm very happy about this, and because it's my first peer-reviewed article since 25 years or so since PhD. I have published a lot, but not in a proper peer review before.
Congratulations.
And otherwise, so I've written a book since last year, which is very well received, but unfortunately it's in German, and it displays a strategy on how to combine global prosperity with an intact planet from an environmental point of view.
Any final thoughts?
Well, I hope that we really reconsider our policies, and we really need to switch the way we think about these types of energies. They have to become responsible for what's happening in the grid. So the grid stability is absolutely essential to modern civilizations. So the importance of having a stable power supply, this is really the blood in our veins. Gross national product is transformed energy. And if the energy stops, everything stops.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for all your contributions, your wisdom, Bjorn. Thanks all of our commenters and viewers online. This has been the Ecomodernist channel live. You can find us here every Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific on YouTube at the Ecomodernist channel live or at Ecomodernist1. You can find us on Facebook at the Ecomodernist Society of North America, and on my personal Twitch, rebroadcast to Soyaddle on Twitch or soyaddle.tv, on my personal LinkedIn, Carl Alex Pauls, and on x.com, Carl Alex Pauls. Please support us on Patreon at the Ecomodernist channel. And remember, missions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.